Okay. So that's causal thinking. And we're going to follow some this cause and effect relationship. And we're going to use this workshop as an example. You have your goal is improved strategic plans. So how will you achieve that? Your activities, you're going to start with this workshop. You're attending this workshop, and the Evaluation Association has prepared this workshop so that people can learn more about strategic plans, right? And theory of change and logic models. So if you attend the workshop, if you hold the workshop, so the Mongolian Evaluation Association has created this workshop and participants attend, you guys are attending it, then you're all going to have increased knowledge about how to create and build logic models, understand theories of change, and then learn how to present logic models. With that increased knowledge, if you have the increased knowledge, then you can increase your use of them. You'll be able to build that logic model. You'll actually be able to explain yourself the theory of change to other people in logic models. And then if you're using these training methods that I'm going to show you on creating logic models, then the strategic plans will improve. And that's your goal. You'll have improved strategic plans. So that's the theory of if-then relationships. So now let's look at logic models. Logic models are a graphical representation of a theory of change. They're just a way of thinking, and they have tons of applications. So a logic model lists the program outputs, inputs, activities, and outcomes without specifying how each of these are connected. The theory of change specifies how they're connected. So you need them both. Here's some, I think, super important things to consider about logic models. First of all, they represent what is supposed to happen according to the theory of change, not necessarily what will happen, because until you implement, you don't know exactly how it's going to work. That's a theory. That's what makes it a theory of change, right? They appear linear, but theories of change rarely are. It's not because you've conducted a workshop and people attended it that automatically they're going to know how to use it and that they're going to be able to implement it. They may need more training. They may need more instructional materials. They may need other things that it's not just a direct one after another. But that is where the theory of change comes in. There are commonly multiple strategies within logic models. And the thing about that, and that's true in life, you have a couple of things that are going to happen at the same time, and they will coincide at certain points, and then they will go apart at certain points. And if you're trying to put all of that into one logic model, it makes it a little difficult to track, to follow across. So keep that in mind. And a logic model focuses on the positive outputs and outcomes, because that's your theory of changes. This is what you believe will happen, and you want something positive to happen. The problem is that it doesn't always work that way. And the best, I think, accompaniment to a logic model would be a risk assessment. And keep that in mind as you're building and expanding your M&E expertise. Risk assessments are also really important. Now, logic models can look a lot of different ways. I'm going to show you a couple different ones. As long as they have the main components, you're gonna nail it. It's going to be really good, and you'll be happy that you've done it, because it organizes your brain and says, okay, now it's not overwhelming anymore. This is what we can do. And it can be a one-stop shop for stakeholders. We're going to talk about stakeholders later throughout, actually, but really focusing on some stakeholders. And the nice thing is you have this succinct graphic representation that they can follow. And it's really, really beneficial when you start presenting. So what are the components of a logic model? Well, you have your program title, and then you have a situational statement. So basically explaining what the issue is. Situation priorities. It's important to remember that you can't solve everything. If you want to improve education, it takes a community effort, it takes administration efforts, it takes teacher efforts, and it takes family efforts. So you have to decide in your program what you're going to prioritize in your situation. Then your desired goal or your strategic objective or objectives, inputs, outputs, short, medium, and long-term outcomes, and then your assumptions. And we'll go through these. So let's talk about a situational statement. So the idea is that you're creating a short statement that answers these following questions. What is the problem or issue? Why is it an issue? For whom is it an issue? Who has a stake in the issue? And what do we know about the issue and the people? What research or experience do we have? So getting all of those questions answered in a succinct statement is a lot. And you can't go into any detail really about how you're going to get all of these answered in a succinct statement. So I've given a couple of different examples here. A situational statement, this project that we're going to use as an example is think in terms of a foundation that is gathering money, finding money to support a university funding for university. So limited funding for higher education restricts Xanadu's ability to conduct research and improve best practices for improved sustainable agriculture production and conservation practices. So I use the fictional country of Xanadu, and these are the problems that were identified. Looking down at this situation, Xanadu agriculture practices are not sustainable, and they do not incorporate best conservation practices. That's the problem and issue for the country. The problem and issue for the foundation is that limited funding for higher education restricts Xanadu's ability to conduct this research. But if the University of Xanadu, this is your theory of change, causal thinking, right? If the University of Xanadu received funding and collaborated with other universities, then it can improve research and teach best practices that would increase sustainable agriculture using improved conservation methods. You can see why it's an issue, because it's limiting their ability to conduct research and improve agricultural practices in Xanadu. For whom is it an issue? Who has a stake in the issue? Well, the University of Xanadu has a stake in the issue. The people of Xanadu have a stake in the issue. The country, the government would have a stake in the issue. The producers, the teachers, or the professors at the university. You can think of all the people who would have a stake in this, right? And then what do we know about the issue and people? That's outlined here in this situation. So you can see once you've thought all this out, it's a lot easier when you answer these questions. It's a lot easier to put together the statement. You want to start with that. Next, you identify your goals and strategic objectives. So a lot of people can interchange goals and strategic objectives. I do that. And I'm going to, in this, probably, I tend to focus on using the word strategic objective, but they're very similar. A goal is like a broad, long-term outcome that is reasonable to achieve within a specific time period. A strategic objective is a high-level and measurable goal that helps organizations achieve their vision and strategy. As I said, I'm going to be using them interchangeably. I think that you can decide what word is more comfortable for you. So the strategic objective is, what do you want to achieve? And this, to me, the second point is probably the most important part of identifying your strategic objective. What is the highest level, thinking in terms of your cause and effect relationship that goes higher, short to medium to long term outcomes, you think you can achieve with the time and resources that are available to you? A goal may be different than the strategic objective. It may not be. Examples of goals and strategic objectives are improve higher education, increase sustainable agriculture, increase economic growth. So you can see as a goal, increased economic growth is good, but chances of your specific program being able to increase economic growth is pretty limited, more than likely, unless you've got unlimited funding. In our example of the foundation, the fact that they're raising money for the University of Xanadu to improve its research and sustainable agricultural training is not in and of itself going to increase economic growth, but it will definitely contribute to that. What are outputs and outcomes, and what's the difference? Outputs are the direct products of the program activities, what we do. So the workshop, for example, this workshop, an output is that the workshop was conducted. Number of sessions, how many workshops are conducted, how many people attended, how often they attended. Those are different outputs. They're pretty easy to see because they are directly related to the activities that you do, and you have control over those. They're evidence that the activities were performed as planned. Okay, so outputs, a lot of people I've worked with want to focus when they develop indicators. I don't know if you're going to have a session on indicators, but they want to develop indicators for outputs because it's something they can control and it's an easy one to measure. But when you start thinking about outcomes, it's harder to measure. And you can see here, it gets harder as you go farther up the ladder. So short-term changes in learning, increased awareness, increased knowledge, attitudes, skills, improved opinions, increased motivation. Those are changes that happen in a person, right? They have this increased awareness. Medium term is action. So you take that awareness and you change your behavior. You change your decision making. You upgrade or update or change your policies or your social action. Those are medium term, because the long term are changes in conditions. So social well-being, health, economic, civic, environmental, those are the long-term conditions. So you see that it goes from the things, outputs that you readily control, to short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes, which you have much less control over. But you're hoping, your theory of change is that if I do all these things and they participate in them, or that actual changes in behavior and learning and action will happen. Critical assumptions are the conditions that you assume to be true for your theory of change or your logic model to work as you intended it to. The thing is about critical assumptions is that they are outside of your control. So if you can control it, they're generally not considered critical assumptions. Examples can include change in government. You don't have control over that. If a war breaks out, weather conditions, financial collapse, funding, those are critical assumptions. Example, beneficiaries receive the intervention. So if you have training and the beneficiaries can't attend, it would be impossible for your theory of change to be right or to work out for you. Okay. So now we're going to go into a section of different options for building a logic model. I'm going to go through 4 of them. The first option is where you identify your long-term outcome of interest. So what's the highest level you think you can achieve with the time and the resources you have? And then you work backwards and you ask how. And I'm going to show you how that looks. Now, for me, I use this all the time. Whenever I get a new project or a new program, I create what's called a results framework, which is what this is called, a results framework. You start with the highest level, which is improve sustainable development and improve conservation for our project. And then you ask how. How can you improve sustainable development? Well, if you improve the agricultural procedures, you will improve the sustainable development. If you improve conservation, how would you improve conservation? By improving your agricultural procedures, that will help improve your conservation. So how would you improve your agricultural procedures? Well, higher education, if that was better, then the university could do extension and improve the agricultural procedures. And research, they can conduct research, which will also then improve the agricultural procedures. How would they do that? How would they improve higher education and increase the research? Well, increased donor funding would allow higher education to improve and for research to ramp up, as well as cross-university collaborations. How would you do this? Well, increased awareness of the university and partner donors would be one way to increase donor funding, and outreach would also help increase donor funding and cross-university collaboration. So that's this theory of change. You start with this and you get all the ask to the how. That is the results framework, right? And that is now your theory of change. Well, let me go back, and the next steps, once you've identified the how and you've gotten your theory of change, is to identify who's going to be involved, reached, targeted, or a participant, identify activities, products, and events that have to be undertaken, and then what resources are needed to reach these people, what assumptions have we made, and then what external factors outside of our control can affect our theory of change. So now let's go back. We've got this. This is the logic model we're going to create based on those other next steps. So the inputs, what are we going to invest? So the University and Xanadu staff and directors are inputs, right? Associated donor boards are inputs, US universities or other universities, grants, anything you could think of that you need to invest to make your project successful. And there's probably more that I didn't include on here. These are just examples. So those are the inputs. The outputs are the activities that you're going to achieve, or that you're going to do, excuse me. You're going to ensure that the donors can receive the donations, and they have to go through a process to make sure that that's something that this foundation can do. Identify US universities with complementary programs, update websites, initiate a social media campaign. These are different activities that this foundation has identified that they are going to do to achieve those goals, those outcomes and outputs that they need. They're going to reach donor organizations, they're going to university administrators, university researchers, and the Xanadu agricultural community. Those are who they're going to reach, the participation people. Now, outcomes, the short-term results, increased donor funding, increased support of the programs and activities, improved collaboration between institutions and the University of Xanadu, and then improved reputation of the University of Xanadu, which will then increase funding, increase donors, increase participation, increase student enrollment, level of research. The medium term that will then improve sustainable agricultural procedures, and improved higher education and increased research. Once we've achieved those, then we will have improved sustainable development and improved conservation. Assumptions and external factors I had outlined on the earlier slide, which I can just briefly show you. So the university leadership remains stable. There are no weather catastrophes. Donor organizations do not disband, and there's no financial collapse. So that's an example of how you build a logic model starting with the results framework. And I use this for myself. I actually have tried to implement this as a brainstorming session with a bunch of people who were not M&E people and did not understand necessarily results. They didn't understand cause and effect thinking, and it took hours to do. So it's got a limitation there in that people kind of need to understand a little bit of theory of change in order to be able to really get a good results framework out of it. But once they do, you can look and you can see, build this logic model, and it's nice and clean. The beauty is you read it, across, and it makes sense to people. So another option is to identify the long-term outcome of interest. That's the first thing you're always going to do, because you always have to go towards set your goal or strategic objectives. And then you move straight to the activities column. It's amazing. I've found that people know what activities they want to undertake before they even know what they want to get out of it. It's just like, yes, they'll talk about the activities. That's the first thing they want to do, because again, they're not that, they aren't thinking that much about the results. I always have to tell them, think higher than just activities. But if you start with activities, they're very happy with that. They can do that. Write down what you plan to do. What's the intervention? They will very comfortably start with activities. And then you complete that chain of connections. It links the activities to the long-term outcomes. Who needs to be reached? Who needs to be engaged? If you connect an activity, what do you believe will happen as a result? So you can just ask those questions. You have to become a facilitator for brainstorming to get these, to really get a good logic model going. And this is a really good one for people of mixed capacity, because of that activities column being the very second thing you do after you're identifying your long-term outcome of interest. And honestly, that long-term outcome of interest is generally what the project is designed to do, and everybody seems to know what that is, at least. So that's good. And then you can identify the inputs you have and those you still need, and then list your assumptions and list your external factors. So that looks like you start here with your goal, then you fill in your activities, then you identify the outputs related to the activities. You take from the outputs, what are your short-term outcomes? What are your medium-term outcomes? And then you go, what are your inputs? So your inputs are sort of apart from that. But other than that, the goal, the activities, outputs, short-term, medium-term, and then your inputs. And again, you include your critical assumptions in that. Always start with your goal. So that's two different ways of doing it. The third option is to identify your long-term outcome of interest. Again, that's always the first thing you're going to do. Then brainstorm all the things that need to happen to reach long-term outcomes. So the difference between this option and the second option is that in that first, the earlier option is you're going straight to activities. In this, you're just having people brainstorm everything. They can, if they want to cluster activities, they can do that. They can, you brainstorm everything, and then you gather them and you put them in buckets, and you can start clustering things, and you test those connections. Once you've got that long-term outcome or goal, that first step, you just let everybody talk. Somebody, if you're the facilitator or whoever is your facilitator, just writes everything down. Let them talk, let them get it out, because that actually creates this amazing connection among people. They get very excited. They're super, super interested in doing it. And one thought leads to another, and it may be another outcome. It may be an output. It may be an activity, but it doesn't matter, because you're putting them all down, and then you're going to organize them. And people are, I found this to be the most useful of all of them, because they really get excited about it. And when you get people excited about doing something, they get invested in it, and they want to see how it's going to look. And it's very exciting for people, and they feel like they have a little piece in it. And that's important, especially when they have to eventually become implementers of it. The fourth approach is to identify your long-term outcome of interest. As I said, that's always the case, and then reverse the order of the logic model so that the outcomes are the first label to the left, followed by outputs and activities, and then finally inputs are at the far right. So what that looks like is you have your goal here, or your strategic objectives, right? And then you go to medium, short-term, outputs. Oh, I'm sorry. Outputs, activities, and then inputs. And you're still having I think the key here is that you have these basic components. In all of the examples I showed you, these key components were there. How you put them together doesn't matter. It's what works for you and your team or the team that is building this logic model. If it, what makes sense to them, as long as they have, excuse me, these 6 different pieces to it, it doesn't matter what order they put them in, as long as it makes sense to them, because you've got all the components. And what may work for one group doesn't work for the other. But that's the beauty of logic models, is that there are so many different ways to approach them, so many different ways to do them and read them. So I wanted to, a lot of people think that a logic model is the same as a logical framework or a log frame. And I just wanted to just briefly tell you that, show you this graphic of, they're not the same. This has a lot more information in it, a log frame. It includes indicators, how you're going to verify those indicators, and also the risks and assumptions. Remember earlier I said that risks and assumptions really aren't, or the risks anyway, aren't generally focused on the logic model, like the possible negative things that could happen. But this is sort of a one-stop shop. It's a log frame has a lot of information in it, but that's also kind of the downside, is that it has so much information in it that it's sometimes hard to track. So you have the summary. It's not going to be as in-depth as a logic model is, but you have your goals. So improve sustainable development. An indicator of that could be the number of acres under crop rotation, a means of verification, farmer reported observation or field, measurement. The risks and assumptions of the other factors may affect the ability to rotate the crops, and the fidelity of the application of the methods is critical. So this goes down from goals to objectives. We've gone through these now in the logic model, the outputs and the activities, but you can see it's a summary. It is not as in-depth as a logic model is. And it includes a lot of information. That there's also a thing called the performance indicator reference sheet. So when you identify the indicators that you want for your results, the outcomes that you're looking for, you have a whole sheet associated with just that indicator, which gives all this information as well. So this is a good sheet to hand out to people if you just a quick view. You can't see everything. It's very much of a big picture thing, but there are other tools that will also get this and get the information you're looking for here. So it does list the program activities, the outputs, the outcomes, and the goals, but also the underlying risks, the measurable time-bound indicators. Okay, so that it's a lot more involved. It's a great handout for people who are interested but don't want that in depth, because you're only getting a summary. And you might find them saying, well, what about this or what about that? And you're like, I couldn't fit everything on there. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so now you've created your logic model. First of all, congratulations. And you now have an idea of, how your theory of change is going to work and how the logic model is going to represent that. And I'm so proud of you for having done all that. That's like awesome. Yay. And you had great brainstorming sessions and everybody's excited. Now you have tested it and you're ready to disseminate. You got to consider how you want it to look. So, should you include all the details? Should you include just some of the details? Should you include highlights that tell the story with or without your input? Now remember, you've created a version of this. That is a lot to track, right? You have to explain to your audience or your stakeholders what the inputs are. Then you have to explain what the outputs are, what the activities are, who's going to participate, who's going to get reached. And then you're going to have to track across what the short-term results are, and then the medium-term results, and then the ultimate impact. You got to put all that in there, right? Not everybody is going to be able to track that or want to, right? So that's a lot of information that they're going to need to have somebody explain to them. Or are they? You can also create this, which includes, again, this is the foundation that is trying to get funding for the University of Xanadu. So their vision is a future of economic prosperity, preserved natural resources, and equal opportunities for all throughout Xanadu. Their mission is to stimulate and promote sustainable development and conservation in Xanadu by providing resources and opportunities to support higher education. Right there on the sheet. So you can see, if you conduct outreach and awareness of the foundation in the University of Xanadu, then your graphics show that you will get donor funding, and it will lead to partnerships between international institutions and the university and support programs and activities of the university. If you have that, then it will lead to higher education, improved higher education and increased research. If you have that, then you'd have improved sustainable agricultural procedures in Xanadu and sustainable development and improved conservation, and then economic growth in Xanadu, the goal. So the graphics help drive this. It's much cleaner. It's easier to follow. It's also a very basic. It's giving you the highlights, right? Sometimes that's all people want. Here's another one, another version. So if you follow this, you actually don't need to have the input. You want to be there, but you don't have to. So the foundation provides outreach, awareness, and donors through organization strategy and business operations, social media, fundraising, and partnerships, so that donors, the University of Xanadu, and international education institutions can increase funding, conduct research, collaborate on research and agricultural processes, and strengthen higher education, which can lead to improved outcomes, such as improved agricultural procedures, improved sustainability, improved conservation, and ultimately might improve other life outcomes in Xanadu, such as economic growth. So you see, that tells the story itself. It's different from the logic model itself. It's a form of the logic model, but it's a much higher level. And because you have these boxes up here that tell the story, if you're not there to explain it, because even on this one, you kind of have to explain it. With this one, you don't as much. People are going to have questions, and that's great. You want that, but you got to meet them where they need to be, where their interests are. So presenting your logic model, you don't want to lose your audience at the finish line. Okay, you've worked really hard to get that. So how should you present your logic model? Well, there are 4 questions you need to answer. Who will the audience be? What is the goal of showing them the logic model? It's like, why are they interested in seeing it? What information do they need? So how much information do they need? And how much time do they have to absorb the information? And you could see those 3 versions of the logic model that I showed you are going to appeal to different parts of the audiences here, depending on the answers to these questions. So who are the stakeholders in this project? We have people associated with managing the project, people who are associated with the funding, right? People associated with implementing the project, people associated with prioritizing the project, advertising the project, getting that money, right? So if we were to brainstorm some examples of people managing the project, the kind of logic model that they might care about would probably be that the biggest one, right? The in-depth one. Whereas people associated with the funding of it, they may not want all the detail. They might want all the detail. Implementing it, if somebody has an idea on which logic model would be best for the people implementing it, it's more than likely they want that detail, right? And people associated with prioritizing that project needs to continue to get funding may or may not need the in-depth, or maybe the second version where you get to be with them and explain it to them. People associated with advertising, they probably aren't going to want that big full one. They're probably going to be happier with something that's more succinct. So let's talk about the stakeholders and what kind of information they're likely to want. They're implementers. Go into detail, include all aspects of the logic model. They need to operationalize that project, so they need to see everything. M&E specialists, go into detail because they're going to help you develop, or we as M&E specialists, we're going to need all aspects of that to identify indicators and the data sources, targets, etc. They need the detail. Supervisors, they want to know that the project is well thought out, but they don't need or want the same level of detail as the implementers. More than likely, we have exceptions to that, and I'll talk about it. A CEO generally only provide the high-level outline. They only have time to glance at it and keep the number of words to a minimum because they'll get overwhelmed, they won't care, or they'll be like, there's nothing I can do with this. Give them the highlights. Now, donors only provide the information that they care about. What will their money be used for? How will it achieve the goal? In general, it's not as detailed as the main logic model, but that depends also. It might be. And then you have passive recipients. So if you're going to put something up on social media, chances are you want it to tell its own story. So that third logic model. But you also have to consider your audience. And this is important. So you need to prepare your presentation of your logic model to meet the audience at their level of interest. So there's generally 4 levels of interest, or high interest people with high influence. You provide all the details because they care about it and they can influence whether your project moves forward, whether it continues to get funding, whether it gets advertised. It's important. Give them the details. There's also high interest, but low influence. So give them the influence, give them the details as well. If they have high interest, give them the option of as much detail as they want, even if they have low influence. Now, low interest and low influence, just highlights. They don't really care about it. They're tangential to the project probably, and they aren't in a position to influence it. So maybe your colleagues, where somebody is a different project and they're curious what you're doing, but they don't need to go into all the details, something like that. You provide them with the highlights. Low interest, high influence. You also provide them with the highlights, but you give them options. Okay. That's why we created more than 1 or 2 types. We have all 3 types. Meet them at their interest level. So the other thing you got to think about is whether time is a factor, like how much time they have to prepare, to dedicate to looking at this logic model, and also how they're going to receive it. So if they're in a meeting if you're in a meeting and you're presenting a logic model and there's mixed stakeholders, which means there are people with high interest, low influence, and low interest, specialists, there are people who really care about it, people who need all that. If you get them in a mixed meeting, it's probably better not to present the full logic model. If the greater number of stakeholders is not interested. If you have a short amount of time, stick with these 2 bottom ones. And if you're in the meeting itself, it's kind of nice to have this second one, but the third one is also really nice in that it tells the story, and people like to see the icons. That helps a lot. If it's in an email or an attachment, again, it's still going to depend on who it is and if they're interested. If it's an email or an attachment, but they're implementers, then you're going to give them the full presentation. But if it's an attachment to the CEO or an email to the CEO, you could probably give them the high level one and they'll follow up with you. If you're in an office with just one person and that person has high influence but low interest, you might give them that second one because you can talk them through that. And they can continue, they could ask questions and you could fill in any details that you want. In a report to funding organizations, if the funding organization is only interested in, they don't want the details, provide them with the second, probably the third, any kind of report, any kind of static report. You're probably better off using this last one because it tells the story without you. However, as I said, and I hope you picked that up, it really depends on who your audience is and what their level of interest is and what they're going to do with the information as to which one you do. And then on social media, I would go with this last one probably because that tells the story without you having to be there. That doesn't leave a lot to their imagination. So the method of delivery and the presentation style is all really important, and whether time is a factor as to how you present your logic model. So just to show you again, high interest, both low and high influence, you're going to give them the full logic model, especially if you're in an office with one person. In an email or as an attachment, provide the highlights. In a report, provide the highlights. If they have high and low interest or high and low influence in a meeting with mixed stakeholders, I would go with the modified logic model. You might find you know your audience better. You should do a stakeholder analysis so that when you have that, you know actually how you should best provide the information. You always should have that back pocket, the full logic model whenever you go to a meeting, though, in case they do want it or be able to speak to it. So that's it. You are now all set to build and present your own logic model. You can build it using any of these methods that I talked about or any other one that you find that works effectively. Also, when you present them, people like icons, people like simple, they want to be able to follow it and they'll get super excited, and you'll find that if you're giving it the right information level to the right people, that they're going to be really grateful for what you've done. So thank you for spending some time with me. I'm happy to answer some questions if anybody has any. And yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much, Sue. Yeah, it's very great that you demystified lots of the difference between logic model, logic framework, and theory of change. Great example, so we appreciate. And now we have 10 minutes for a question and answer session because the next speakers will be on time as well. So if you guys have any question from the audience, you can come and speak directly to Susan. Yeah, Shishin has a question.
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. I'm Susie Yang from UNICEF. I have a question about the hierarchy about the results framework. I think you have provided clear definition and good example. I mean, the key indicators of what level of results like awareness and policy and long-term changes, all these kind of things. The thing I want to add is these things are not static. I mean, we need to think about them based on the scale, the level of intervention. Sometimes if a project is only component of a huge intervention, then their logic, their result could be at the output level or immediate level. However, if the small result, a small intervention itself is a standalone project, and then the level of result, it can be changed. Yeah, that's something I want to add.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I completely agree with you. Very, very much so, yeah. There are a lot of different strategies within one program. Yeah, and so you'd be having different results for the different things. Yeah, I completely agree.
Sue, I have oh, okay.
No, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask in regards to data availability and use of data when you're working around developing a framework, because I think oftentimes in Mongolia's case, although data availability is improving overall, there's still some concerns because oftentimes we might think of outcomes related to environment or, social issues that's difficult to track. But nonetheless, we want to include it in the outcome and policy and activities. I think there's maybe discouragement for the planners who, may even exclude that issue altogether just because there's lack of data. So I wonder what has been some best cases that you've encountered in that sense and what sort of recommendation you might give.
It is a big problem everywhere. I mean, not just in Mongolia, obviously, that is a problem everywhere, I think, in that there's two problems. One is getting like clean data, usable data, good data, and the other is having people that are willing to create indicators that are high level and that they are going to be somehow responsible for. They don't want to do that either. So collecting the data is like not often, but I've definitely had situations where people did not want to create indicators at those high levels because they didn't want to be responsible for them. And then you add a situation in which the data aren't always clean or they aren't available, and it's very difficult. I completely agree. We set up programs where we were teaching the people, the enumerators, to go out and collect. So we had a whole program where we did nothing but teach them how to collect data. And even having said that, there were times when they just fudged the numbers and put numbers in, so I think you just have to be very aware and do a lot of training is all I could say on that, and double check all the data sources, because it's an ongoing problem, isn't it?
Right, yeah, it's such a good question. This afternoon, we're going to have a session on evaluability assessment, so we can continue to discuss this.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah.
Anyone else? We have one more question, so, but please, if you have anything else to add, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, feel free to email me if you have any questions.
Fine. Hi, Sue. This is Zola. So I was just wondering, when you are developing a theory of change framework, when you're actually doing the brainstorming, when do you actually start thinking about data and KPIs? What kind of KPIs you will be using for measuring outputs and impact, and as well as when you are presenting at the end, after you have the theory of change, and when you are presenting to a funder, let's say to a CEO or a donor, they might have questions about your KPIs and measurability, etc. So how do you, when do you do that, and how do you do that?
Before the project is approved, in our M&E staff, our monitoring evaluation staff goes through and discusses with each and every implementing organization what their indicators are going to be. And if they have not thoroughly kind of vetted whether they can get that information, then it would not be approved. But your question actually kind of starts a little before that. When do you actually start talking about the data? You start talking about the data after I would say I like to do it right at the results framework part, because the
Mhm.
results are the things that you're really measuring. Outputs, anybody can do that, right? Those are pretty standard. You still have to make sure that they're accurate and you have sources of proving methods of verification that the data are good, you know? But at this point is when I like to look at the results and actually decide what indicators we might want to use. And I found that to be, they already have, the activities will be okay, right? They're going to do the activities because then you'll have your outputs, but this is what matters. And that brainstorming session comes probably after the logic model is all created though, because then their mind is already thinking, you know, and then you go back and you look at the results framework and you're like, okay, what are some, because, okay, I'm sorry. It's a big question, I get excited. The results, it depends on your own project. Like
Right.
what good indicator, you know, or KPI for improved agricultural procedures for me might be very different in my project than what yours is, even though they're both doing the same thing, right? It just could be very different. And it doesn't matter if it's not, if you can't get the data, it doesn't matter. It's not a smart indicator at that point. So you
Yes.
got to reject it and look for another one that you can get the data for. That's really
Mm.
critical, is, you know, identifying those, and also if they can contribute to greater building of knowledge. So any
Mm.
kind of standard indicators are always good too. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Uh-huh.
Thank you very much, Sue. Okay,
Thank
one
you.
last question, because our next speaker is joining in 1 minute.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your presentation. And the question I have is, have you ever been faced or experienced the case that when you evaluate in any intervention or the project, but the logic model from the beginning, it should have been like defined differently, or it should have been interpreted differently, right? Because usually when we work as a external evaluator for the, like, let's say ex post evaluation, right? We do not need to go to the logic models. We just work and evaluate what they did or what has achieved, etc. But there are times that from the beginning, the logic models should have been interpreted differently, right? So in that case, what could be the choice, what we can do?
I have had situations in which people have undertaken a project without even doing a logic model. And so then I go back and recreate it, and they could see that these were never going to work, you know, or they created a logic model and it is so weak and has so many holes in it that it's not surprising that the project is not doing well. It all has to, for me, it all has to happen before you implement the project. And so when you come in after the fact and you're having to piece stuff together because they didn't do it in the beginning, it's one of, to me, that would be one of the findings, you know, of your evaluation, because your theory of change is the very first thing you need to do. And if they haven't done that or done it correctly, or they're not adhering to it and not modifying their logic, well, there's nothing wrong with modifying if they find that the situation has changed, right? Then as an evaluator, it's after the fact, you know, that they made a mistake and the project is probably going to reflect that. I wish I had a better answer for you on that. I have had situations that's frustrating.
All right, thanks very much, Susan. And another round of applause for you.
Oh, thank you. It
Thank you
was a
very
lot of
much.
fun to talk to you.
Yes, and I know you sent also other supplementary materials, which I will also send to all the participants along with your presentation. And thanks very much,
Great.
Susan, again.
Thank
See you
you.
next
Bye-bye.
year. Bye.
Enjoy yourselves. Bye.
Yeah, bye.